Try this one more time from my home in Northwest Indiana. I apologize for the technical glitches. This is my first time doing this. And we're going to talk a little bit about searching for 20th century draft registration records. And elections are three major conflicts where we have U.S. draft records: Civil War, World War I, and World War II. There's a little bit of difference in the various registrations and the content and the questions that we're asked, and we're going to focus primarily on the 20th century records because they do include a little bit more detail and some really great information that can give your research a real boost. But first, let's navigate to them. As you could maybe see, I just clicked on the search tab and went to the card catalog. And using the filters over here, we can quickly navigate over to military, draft enlistment and service, and USA. And then if we scroll down a bit more, we can even select a decade, so we can focus on one particular conflict that we're interested in. So I selected the 1940s for World War II. And the largest collection of draft registration records we have here is from 1942. And I always like to search directly from the collections that we have available. And I do this for a couple of reasons. First of all, when you're searching directly from a record collection, you're working with a search form that was created expressly for the collection, and it's suited to the index, the different things that we've indexed in that collection. And secondly, a lot of times we kind of skip over. If you scroll down at the bottom, we have a description, but there's some really helpful details in these descriptions that it's really worth noting. For example, down here we see the fourth registration, often referred to as the old man's registration or the old man's draft. It was conducted, the date it was conducted was April 27th, 1942. And also, we want to know who was included in this draft. In this case, it included men who were born between April 28th, 1877 and February 16, 1897. These were men who were between 45 and 64 years old and who were not already in the military. And that brings up another really important point too. A lot of times we may think, well, you know, my grandfather, I know he never served in World War II, but maybe he was born within this range and he may be included in this. A lot of times we think of a draft registration as mainly a military collection, but a lot of men who didn't serve were included in the draft, and only some of them were called up to actually serve. And in the case of this registration, not many, if any, were called up because these were older men. So that's another helpful thing to note. Another thing you can find in the description is the coverage, and that's really important as well. You look down here, these are the states that are included in this collection, and the states where you see an asterisk, we have incomplete coverage so far. So this is something that we're still adding records to states as we acquire them. And there are some states, if we go down a little further, these 8 states here, unfortunately, it says these records were destroyed several years ago and they were never microfilmed. So we're never going to be able to get these records, which is really sad. But fortunately, we do have some records, and this collection is growing, and it's a really useful database. I want to flip over quickly to a record I pulled up in a collection that we just launched this week. This is actually a young man's draft for World War II. And this draft covered men born on or before January 1st, 1922 and on or before June 30th, 1924. Right now, we currently only have North Carolina available for this, but these are records that weren't available previously, so this is really a neat collection to have. It's an exciting thing that these are finally becoming available. This is a draft registration card for James Franklin Freddi, and you can see some of the great details we have here. His place of residence in North Carolina. It gives his age and date of birth, as well as a place of birth, Greensboro, North Carolina. Another really interesting clue on these records is the name and address of a person who will always know your address. I always like to think about, when I'm looking at a record, how would I answer this question? If I was asked the name of a person who would always know my address, I would obviously go immediately to a family member, a spouse, perhaps, or a parent, or if the parents had predecessed the person, perhaps you would go to a sibling. So usually you're going to find a relative named in this space. In this case, Mrs. W.B. Scott, we looked, it was interesting that she had a different surname. I thought at first perhaps it was a sister, but as it turned out, a little bit of further research, and it turned out this was actually his mother. And realizing that she had remarried and since the time he was born, we went out and looked, and we were able to find his death certificate on Ancestry.com. He actually died in 1932 in a car accident. So that was kind of a neat little piece of the puzzle that, you know, this clue of her having a different surname brought about. So I want to take this information. Oh, and the last thing I wanted to point out is his employer's name and address are included. Beacon Manufacturing Company and Swannanoa, Buncombe County, North Carolina. And I apologize to any Swannanoans out there if I mispronounced that. But anyways, so let's switch back over to another browser, and I'm going to use the information that I found in this record and see what else we can learn about James Franklin Freddi. And we know his birth was listed as 1924. And I'm going to use this just the state of North Carolina. A lot of times when we think about the records that we're searching for, we want to think about how the bits of information that we include in our search are going to be listed in those records. And a lot of times when you find a record, for example, a census record, it's going to ask, a lot of censuses ask for birth dates or birthplaces, but they only gave a state. They don't give it. So I want to match what's in a lot of the records more fully. And then I can come back and tweak it a little bit and maybe put in Greensboro and see if I can come up with some different results. But let's try an initial search using just North Carolina. And we're going. Here we go. And you can see we have a family tree match up on top, but that's not our guy. So we're going to browse down a little. And here you can see we have this is the record we just looked at, that World War II draft card. And below that, one thing that's really interesting, we've got the North Carolina Birth Index. And you can see here, February 14th, only the day is 2 days off. So now I'm wondering, the other thing that's consistent about this record, it shows the birthplace of Greensboro, North Carolina, and this is Guilford County, North Carolina, which Greensboro is actually in Guilford County. So there's something there that there's a couple consistencies and one inconsistency of those 2 years. Another thing we want to think about when we're looking at records is when we look at the conflicts, we want to see, could there have been a reason why this might be off? Perhaps young James was 16 years old and wanted to enlist in the military, and so he fudged his age a little. That happened. So we're going to want to put a pin in these records and look and see if we can find some more details to help us prove that this is the right guy. As we go down, we can see this is not our guy because he died very young. We can look here, this is a 1930 census, and one of the things that jumps right out of this is Swannanoa, Buncombe County, North Carolina. This is where they were living in 1930, 12 years prior. And you can see the family structure here. Father William H., which matches up with that birth record. James is listed as 4 and 8/12, and actually when you look at the record, it's a little bit fuzzy. We can look at the actual image, and I think maybe it might have read 4/12 as opposed to the date, the way we thought. And I'm not going to be able to get to this browser. Here we go. But anyways, I'm not able to scroll over to see this right now. But it looks more like 4/12, and it looks like this indeed is our James Freddi. So another thing that we want to look at, we can scroll down, and it's always a good idea to browse through the whole page, even if you start seeing some records that aren't quite relevant. This is a really interesting record that was also added this week. And this is from Honolulu, Hawaii, National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, which they call Punch Bowl because it's in a crater. And there's a picture of his headstone here. Not only does this give his date of birth that he gave to the military, February 14th, 1924, also lists his date of death, January 7th, 1945, so he died in the war. And I found another reference to this, that he was actually shot down over the Philippines. One thing that's significant new information that we find in this record is that he was a staff sergeant in the 417th Army Air Force Bombardment Group. And we can go over, flip over to, oops, I went to the wrong place, I'm sorry. I want to go over to Google, and we can put in 417 Army Air Force, just as we had it in there. If I wasn't sure of those abbreviations, I could go and search, and you can see we could come up with a Wikipedia entry, and that actually shows some of the places where they were stationed, and indeed they were stationed over the Philippines when he was shot down. And I also found this really neat website here that talks about the 417th, and in it, this is something that I think is really cool. They actually have photographs of some of the men that are in that group, and some of them are labeled. You have to wonder if James is perhaps one of the gentlemen waiting in line here. They have pictures of them at leisure, so you really get to one more record that comes up in our search. James was a really interesting case study for me. Down here we find U.S. World War II Army enlistment records. So it looks like he went and registered for the draft. Perhaps they didn't call him up quick enough, and on October 2nd he went, or October 7th, I'm sorry, he went and actually enlisted in the Air Corps. And one of the interesting things on this, it says his education level was 2 years of high school. Now if you look at that 1926, use that 1926 birth date, if someone had 2 years of high school, that would have put them at maybe age 16. And if we add 16 to his birth date in 1926, that would have been 1942. So perhaps this 16-year-old, this adds more evidence that perhaps this 16-year-old fudged his age in order to get in. So just some interesting things you can learn just going through and pursuing the clues that we find on one record. I want to leave you with one last tip. This is my family tree and Family Tree Maker, and we talked about how we want to look and see what years were covered in a particular collection, what ages the men were who registered for a particular draft. And if I want to go, let's go to all my people. Oh, let's get rid of that. Okay, so here's a list of everyone in my tree. What I can do is use this filter button down here, and I can filter to the group of people that I actually want to do. Let's see, let's start from scratch here. And what I can do is filter in, let's use World War I as an example. 24 million men registered for the World War I draft, and we have those cards available on Ancestry.com. So what we can do is look and see, because we know that the people who registered for that draft were born between 1872. So we want to start with 1872. We want births that are after that date. And we want to say, okay, let's filter out anyone who was born after around 1900. And if you have someone like James, just a little caveat, if you have someone, you think someone like James who fudged their age a little bit, you may even want to expand those parameters. These were the dates that were required to be in there, but some of our ancestors may have been like James and fudged their age a little bit. So we've got people who were born after 1872 but before 1900, and we're going to filter out anyone, obviously, who is a woman because they weren't required to register, and we're going to filter out anyone who died before the registration, which was in 1917 when it began. So now you can see I've brought down from my list of everyone in my tree, I've got a list of 9 candidates who probably I want to go out there and look for in the World War I drafts. These are people that would have been eligible to have registered. So that's just a little helpful tip for you. And I hope that this little session has spurred you or inspired you to go and look for some of your ancestors in these records. You never know what you're going to find. I hope you enjoy this and have a great day.